Hey all, this is Sirius. I'm here reading my story. I was going to try to do a video recording, but my phone was just having a meltdown about that. So I am doing a voice recording, but I hope that y'all still enjoy it. Thank you for voting for my story. I'm really excited to be here as part of the Horror Showdown, and I'm going to be reading Wailies Don't Be Whistling Dixie. I'm sorry if it's awkward. I do not read aloud very often. Gideon's body was still dangling behind his head. It swung from the thick oak tree limb on a brown hemp rope turned dark with rain and spattered in bird shit. He couldn't believe that they left him swinging there with his face peeled off and his severed hands nailed to the tree trunk. It made easy pickings for the buzzards who swarmed the lush green hollow, bursting with new clover and weeds. He had been watching them for days, jabbing at the softest bits of his corpse until their beaks were coated in blood, and ragged bits of his flesh were dangling from the ends of their talons. He had been disgusted at first, but it was hard to process emotions without the bodily reaction to follow. Without a churning stomach to house his revulsion, all he could do was stare with his chin resting in his hands and watch as the sum of his existence was reduced to bone and hard sinew. He knew that he stank, and he knew that the smell of bird shit could not even begin to cover the stench of rot that had spent days festering in the heavy rain and scorching Tennessee sun. He could not smell it, thankfully, he just knew. He wished that he could leave it all behind. Every time he tried walking away, he always ended up back here. This same rock with his blood smeared over the textured surface. This same dry shrub that had jabbed him in the spine when he was knocked down by the men who would leave him dangling from an oak. A buzzard landed in front of him. Gideon looked up. He had seen this one before. It looked at him with human eyes. The eyes of an old man, cloudy like a dead fish and rimmed in red. Not so much like a bird at all, but a gaze that made him feel like death was staring down its nose at him. Gideon tilted his head, and the buzzard moved its own in the same direction. They looked at each other while the wind blew and the rope creaked behind him. The buzzard clacked its beak, and then it spoke. It had the voice of an old Baptist preacher being strained through a radio station. "Are you ready to make it right?" Gideon shook his head. With Thomas? It felt like he was having this conversation for the 100th time, and maybe he was. There's no making it right. It's too late. The buzzard ruffled its feathers and raised its naked head a little higher. "Make it right, or you don't cross. Don't cross, don't sleep." It clacked its beak again. Gideon dragged his fingers down his face. God, he wished he could sleep. "How was I supposed to know?" he muttered. "If I knew he had 3 brothers who were going to pull me apart, I would have... Would have what? Not put those bruises on Thomas's face? He hadn't really meant to, he just sort of lost control. It was easy to do, with enough corn liquor putting fire in his blood. Maybe he would not have slammed Thomas's hand into the bathroom door, but he hadn't meant to do that either. Things were a little bit of a haze, and all he remembered was the look on his boyfriend's pretty dumb face when he cracked his fist over his eye hard enough to leave behind an ugly shiner. Thomas had looked like a kick puppy, and was in tears when he locked himself in the bathroom. If he hadn't tried to shut the door in Gideon's face, he wouldn't have gotten his hand caught in it. And if Thomas hadn't been stepping out in the first place, then the whole argument would never have happened. So really, it wasn't Gideon's fault. Make it right. Easy for a bird to say. Thomas was born in these mountains, Gideon finally said, as if the buzzard was still listening. He's not going to invite in a spirit. The buzzard just stared back at him, unimpressed with all his excuses. It spread its wings and launched itself back into the air, sailing just over his head and back to his dangling corpse. Flesh squelched, and Gideon grimaced. "All right," he said. "All right, I will try. I will try again." The woods that surrounded the modest old house were as thick as they were ancient. The oaks towered over all, concealing the house and all its surroundings in their long shadows. If he had been alive, it would have taken Gideon nearly an hour to walk from the place where he had died. As it stood, he did not even remember the journey. All he had to do was think about the house, and he was there. There was a long, dark path that cut through the grass, coming off the tail end of a deep run in the mud where Thomas's brothers had dragged Gideon behind their truck. He wished that the act alone had been enough to kill him, but all it had done was rip patches of skin off his arms and back. They had made him walk through the forest after that, pistol whipping his back and shoulders every time he slowed or stumbled while asking if he still thought it was okay to hit his boyfriend. It was an unbearable memory. He could still hear the sound of his bones crunching from their blows. Gideon tried to shake it off and put his focus back on the house. It was not the best on the market, but it was what they had been able to afford. The untreated wood that made up the front porch was slouching towards the ground, and the roof had shed a few more shingles since he last set eyes on the place. Gideon paced along the tree line and tried to figure out how to accomplish what the buzzard wanted him to do. Did he need to ask Thomas's forgiveness? That was all he could think of, and it was easier said than done. He'd like to think that being mutilated and strung up was punishment enough for a domestic squabble, but apparently some force out there did not agree. The back door opened, and Gideon paused. He raised his head and watched 2 blue tick hounds dart out the back door. They sniffed around the grass and paused, one of them staring at him with dark, alert eyes. Gideon's lip curled, even though he was sure the dog could not see him, and he snarled in return. The dog growled, and Gideon kept walking, pacing a little farther down the tree line. Only a few seconds later, Thomas appeared at the back door. He looked gorgeous, glowing even. For half a second, Gideon was taken aback. Thomas had not looked like that in years. There were no more bruises on his face, and his blonde hair had grown out just enough to start curling where it brushed his shoulders. He had his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that he sipped from as he watched the dogs run in the yard. He did not seem bothered much by one of the hounds growling, although he said something that Gideon could not hear. One of the hounds turned and went back inside, while the other continued to stare at Gideon. It bared its teeth and barked, its tail standing straight up in the air, pulling its whole body tighter than a banjo string. "Duke!" Thomas's voice carried enough that Gideon could finally hear it. He walked up to the dog and grabbed it by the collar, his other hand still holding his mug. "Duke, come inside now." He glanced towards the woods. "There is nothing there." "Thomas," Gideon called out. As soon as he spoke the name, all the blood drained from Thomas's face. His boyfriend took several steps back, all but dragging the hound with him. "Duke," Thomas's voice broke. "Now, boy." "Thomas!" Gideon stepped away from the tree line. Thomas's eyes became as wide as dinner plates, and his hands shook so badly that his coffee sloshed over the side of his mug and spilled onto his white t-shirt. "No, no." Thomas shook his head. "Not there, not there, not there. If you see something, no you didn't. If you hear something, no you didn't. Not there, not there." His chest heaved as he took a deep breath. "Not there." Duke was going crazy. He whined and barked and growled, straining against his collar. Thomas was half-bent, trying to keep him from breaking away, and finally had to give up on the coffee cup. He let it fall to the ground just for the sake of throwing his other arm around Duke's solid chest. The hound whined again and kicked up dirt with its hind paws. It only got worse as Gideon took another step closer. "Thomas, I want to talk to you," Gideon said. "Can I come inside?" Oh God. Thomas, who had never been particularly religious, sounded like he was about to start praying. "No, no, you're not welcome." He stood up and used both hands to grasp Duke's collar. He half-dragged, half-begged the dog to follow him towards the back door. Duke whined all the way up to the threshold, then, like some spell had been broken, he let out one last yelp and leapt through the open door and into the kitchen. The sudden shift sent Thomas tumbling, and he fell into the grass. The blond man swore, and he pushed himself up to his knees. Thomas's blue eyes found the trees again, and his mouth fell open, although no sound came out. Gideon was working his way down the hill, holding one hand out in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture. It was hard to feel anything other than wonder and a little bit of sorrow. He kept looking at Thomas's hair, his broad shoulders, his soft blue eyes. How long had it been? How much had Gideon missed? Was there another man inside waiting for Thomas, his boyfriend, to return to bed? Gideon couldn't make things right if there was some other bum in the mix to make things even more complicated. He made it all the way to the edge of the yard before he had to stop. He did not know why. He just had to. He planted his feet on the far side of the shed that stood on the edge of Thomas's property and waited. "Thomas," Gideon tried to keep his tone all business. "Talk to me. Come on, stop this. Invite me in so we can talk." "No." Thomas held up one hand. "No, you're not." He paused and heaved another deep breath. "You're not Gideon. Go away." Gideon furrowed his brow. "Thomas." "You're not Gideon." Thomas turned his face away. "And you're not welcome here. Now go back to where you came from." Without looking up again, he pushed himself to his feet and scrambled inside. He slammed the door behind him, and seconds later the lights went out. The sorrow he had already tasted was now eating him from the inside out. Gideon slammed his fist against the shed's wooden side and was surprised to hear it rattle. He had no idea of what his limits were. He had hoped not to linger long enough to find out. Gideon hit the shed again and let out a howl. To him it sounded completely animal, like a coyote caught in a steel trap. He could only wonder what it sounded like to Thomas. He slammed his head against the wooden shed. It did not hurt, but it made another sound. He snarled and hit it again, hard enough that he thought he was going to bash his skull through. Gideon closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was back on the tangled mass of oak tree roots where he had been sitting. He caught sight of his own heavy work boots, caked in mud, and he groaned. Gideon dropped his head and saw the buzzard again. It was sitting just a few feet away, staring at him with those two human eyes. There was a bit of flesh in its beak, and he wondered if it was his own. No good, the buzzard said. Try again. I can't keep doing this, Gideon said. He won't let me in. Make it right or don't cross, the buzzard clicked. Don't cross, don't sleep. Gideon buried his face in his hands and let out another scream. He pulled his knees up and pressed his forehead against them, curling up as tightly as he could while rocking back and forth on the roots, where he was perched. His body swung near his head like the pendulum of a grandfather clock. He really, really wished he could sleep.